The scent of bruised oranges and something indefinably ancient, like sun-baked stone, was the first thing that truly greeted Eleanor Vance in Pueblo Alba. It was stronger, more insistent than the polite smiles of the estate agent or the chirpy welcome from the taxi driver. Could this sun-drenched land, so different from the muted greens and greys of her 67 years in England, truly offer the solace her heart craved after Arthur's passing? The whitewashed houses, tumbling down the hillside towards an impossibly blue Mediterranean, seemed to shimmer with promise, each vibrant splash of bougainvillea a defiant shout of joy. Eleanor, a retired chief librarian, a woman whose life had been catalogued in the hushed reverence of books and the quiet companionship of her late husband, felt a tremor of hope, fragile yet persistent. This move to Andalusia was their shared dream, a sunlit chapter planned for two. Now she was navigating it alone, armed with a modest pension, a dozen carefully packed crates of books, and a yearning for connection that felt as vast as the Andalusian sky. Her rented villa, Casa Serenidad, was small, with a courtyard where a lemon tree grew, its fruit like tarnished gold. As she unpacked, placing her beloved books onto freshly painted shelves, Woolf beside Austen, Garcia Lorca beside Rilke, each volume felt like an old friend in a new land. She imagined lively discussions, new acquaintances who shared her passion for literature, perhaps a small, intimate circle like the one she and Arthur had cherished. Spain, she'd read, was a country of community, of life lived vibrantly in plazas and cafes. A few days into her settling, a shadow fell across her sun-dappled courtyard. "Eleanor Vance, I presume?" boomed a voice. Richard Sterling stood there, a man whose tan seemed professionally applied, his linen shirt impeccably white against it, a stark contrast to Eleanor's practical cotton dress. He was, as the estate agent had mentioned with a note of reverence, a central figure in the expatriate community. "Richard Sterling, welcome to Pueblo Alba. We're having a little get-together, a barbecue for newcomers. Tomorrow, my place, Villa Vista. You simply must come. Everyone will be there." His smile was wide. His eyes, however, seemed to skim over her, already moving to the next item on an internal agenda. "Oh, how very kind," Eleanor managed, a librarian's ingrained politeness taking over. "Thank you, I'd like that." It felt like the right thing to do, the first step towards weaving herself into the fabric of this new life. Richard's Villa Vista lived up to its name, perched high with a panoramic view that seemed to demand admiration. The air, however, was thick, not with the scent of grilling sardines or local herbs, but with a cacophony of loud English pop music and overlapping amplified conversations. Dozens of people, mostly British, milled about, drinks in hand. Eleanor, clutching a small glass of sangria that tasted more of sugar than wine, felt a tightening in her chest. "So, I told him, if you can't get me a tea time before 10, what's the point of being a platinum member, eh?" A red-faced man guffawed, his voice cutting through the general din. Nearby, a woman with elaborately coiffed blonde hair was recounting in minute detail the horrors of her recent kitchen renovation. "And the granite, my dear, not the shade I chose, an absolute nightmare." Eleanor tried to engage. "Pueblo Alba is so beautiful," she offered to a small group. They nodded vaguely. "Yes, lovely. We bought our place 5 years ago, a steal." "Worth double now, of course," one replied, before launching into a detailed comparison of property values along the coast. There were cliques, she noticed, tight knots of people whose shared history seemed impenetrable. Richard, ever the host, flitted between groups, his laughter booming, his hand always on someone's shoulder, yet his eyes never quite settling. He introduced Eleanor to a few people. Eleanor just arrived, frightfully brave, all on her own, and then was gone, leaving her adrift in a sea of unfamiliar faces and conversations that felt like performances. She found herself near a woman meticulously inspecting the canapés. "The prawns are a bit overdone, don't you think?" the woman confided, as if sharing a state secret. Richard usually does better. An hour later, Eleanor slipped away unnoticed. The vibrant colours of Pueblo Alba, as she walked back to Casa Serenidad under a sky rapidly turning indigo, seemed muted. The initial shimmer of promise had dulled. In her quiet courtyard, the scent of lemons was a balm, but a profound sense of isolation had settled in, as heavy and unwelcome as the lingering aroma of Richard's overcharred sausages. This wasn't the connection she'd envisioned. This was something else entirely. something that left her feeling hollow and strangely exhausted. Her books, lined up on their shelves, seemed to offer a more substantial, if silent, companionship. Determined not to be defeated by one lackluster event, Eleanor sought other avenues. She'd seen a notice for a book club at the local English-language library, a small, slightly dusty room above a pharmacy. Her heart lifted. This, surely, would be her tribe. The first meeting, however, quickly disabused her of that notion. The chosen book, a slim volume of Spanish poetry, lay largely untouched on the table. Instead, the conversation, lubricated by several bottles of surprisingly strong local wine, revolved around the latest expat gossip, ailments, "My sciatica is playing up again, must be the damp from the sea," and lengthy competitive anecdotes about grandchildren. Eleanor, who had carefully reread the poems and made thoughtful notes in her beloved notebook, clutched it in her lap, a silent testament to her unmet expectations. When she ventured a comment about a particularly striking metaphor, it was met with a brief, polite nod before the conversation swerved back to someone's disastrous attempt at making paella. She left feeling more like an anthropologist observing a peculiar ritual than a participant in a shared passion. Then there was the cultural evening, an invitation procured with some effort by a well-meaning neighbour. It was a formal dinner at a grand, slightly faded hotel, attended by a mix of long-established expatriates and a few local Spanish dignitaries, the mayor, a doctor, a solemn-faced lawyer. The conversation was stilted, conducted in a careful mix of English and heavily accented Spanish. Eleanor, dressed in her best silk blouse, found herself seated next to a woman who spoke exclusively about her prize-winning roses and the difficulty of finding good domestic help. The Spanish guests were polite, almost reverential, but an invisible barrier seemed to hang in the air. It was an evening of performative civility, of carefully chosen words and even more carefully guarded thoughts. She ate her lukewarm sea bass, smiled when appropriate, and felt a profound sense of unreality, as if watching a play where all the actors knew their lines but had forgotten the emotions behind them. Richard Sterling, meanwhile, continued his campaign to integrate her into the social whirl. "Coffee morning, Eleanor? Next Tuesday, the Blue Parrot Cafe. All the girls will be there." She declined, pleading a prior engagement with her unpacking, though her books had long since found their places. He suggested bridge, a game she'd never learned and had no inclination to. Each invitation, though ostensibly kind, began to feel like a subtle pressure, a reminder of her failure to slot neatly into the predefined social niches of Pueblo Alba. The few events she did attend out of a sense of obligation only deepened her unease. They were variations on a theme, conversations that skated on the surface, a subtle undercurrent of comparison, whose villa was grander, whose Spanish was more fluent, whose retirement more enviably active, and a pervasive sense of people playing roles rather than being themselves. In these moments of growing disillusionment, Eleanor found solace in solitude. Her small courtyard became her sanctuary. She would sit there for hours, the Andalusian sun filtering through the lemon leaves, a book open in her lap, often unread as she simply absorbed the sounds of the town, the distant cry of a fruit vendor, the chime of church bells, the laughter of children playing in a hidden alleyway. She took long, solitary walks along the rugged coastline, the wind whipping her silver bob, the vastness of the sea a counterpoint to the small anxieties that gnawed at her. She began to frequent the local market, not just for her groceries, but for the simple human interactions. Carmen, the fruit vendor, with eyes as bright as her polished cherries, would greet her with a warm "Hola guapa" and patiently help Eleanor with her faltering Spanish. Mateo, the owner of a tiny dark cafe tucked away near the old church, served the strongest coffee Eleanor had ever tasted and would nod gravely as she murmured "Delicioso." These were fleeting, impersonal connections, yet they felt more real, more grounded than the forced bonhomie of the expat gatherings. Her journal, a handsome leather-bound volume Arthur had given her, became her confidant. "It is not that people are unkind," she wrote one evening, the ink flowing slowly from her fountain pen. "It is that the connections feel insubstantial, like trying to grasp smoke. I came seeking community, but perhaps I am looking in the wrong places, or for the wrong kind of community. There is a loneliness here that the sun cannot quite dispel." She was beginning to understand what she didn't want, the types of interactions that left her feeling diminished rather than enriched, the large, noisy gatherings where true conversation was impossible, the meetings where the original purpose was lost to trivialities, the formal affairs heavy with unspoken rules, the undercurrent of boasting and comparison that made her feel small. One afternoon, exploring a labyrinth of narrow, whitewashed streets she hadn't ventured down before, she heard a rhythmic, earthy thudding. Drawn by the sound, she found herself outside a small, unassuming doorway, a faded wooden sign above it reading, Sofia Herrera, Ceramica. Peeking through the slightly ajar door, she saw a woman, perhaps in her late 50s, her dark hair streaked with grey and tied back loosely, her hands covered in clay as she worked at a potter's wheel. The woman's concentration was absolute, her movements fluid and economical. The studio was cool and dim, smelling of damp earth and something ancient. Pots in various stages of completion lined the shelves, simple, unpretentious shapes with a quiet beauty. Eleanor felt an immediate sense of peace, a stark contrast to the restless energy of the places she'd been frequenting. She must have made a sound, for the woman looked up, her dark, intelligent eyes meeting Eleanor's. She didn't smile immediately, but there was no unfriendliness in her gaze, only a calm appraisal. "Pardon," Eleanor murmured, feeling like an intruder. "Your work, it's very beautiful." The woman wiped a clay-stained hand on her apron. "Gracias," she said, her voice low and steady. She gestured to the pots. "Passe, if you like." Eleanor stepped inside, her gaze drawn to a small, perfectly imperfect bowl glazed in a deep Mediterranean blue. "This is lovely," she said, almost to herself. Sofia Herrera nodded. "The sea here, it has many blues." That was all. Eleanor bought the bowl, a small extravagance, and left. But the image of Sofia in her quiet studio, her hands shaping something real and beautiful from the earth, stayed with her. It was a flicker of something different, a hint of an authenticity she had almost despaired of finding. A week later, drawn back by an undeniable pull, Eleanor returned to Sofia's studio. She'd told herself she needed a small vase for the wildflowers she'd picked on her walk. Sofia was there, sanding a newly fired piece, a fine dust coating her arms. She looked up and offered a small, genuine smile of recognition. "Ah, la signora inglesa," Sofia said, not unkindly. "Eleanor," she supplied. "I came back for a vase, perhaps." As Sofia showed her a few simple, elegant pieces, they began to talk, haltingly at first, then with more ease. Sofia spoke of her craft, of learning from her grandmother, of the feel of the Andalusian clay between her fingers. She spoke of her love for the quieter rhythms of Pueblo Alba, the parts tourists and many expats overlooked, the early morning light on the fishing boats, the taste of wild asparagus gathered from the hills. She didn't ask Eleanor intrusive questions, nor did she offer unsolicited advice or boast of her own accomplishments. She simply shared and listened with a quiet intensity that made Eleanor feel truly seen. "Many people come here for the sun," Sofia said, her gaze thoughtful as she wiped dust from a finished pot. "But sometimes they forget to look for the shade, for the quiet places where things grow." Eleanor left that day with a small terracotta vase and something far more precious, a burgeoning sense of hope. Sofia Herrera was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply, profoundly herself. And in her presence, Eleanor felt a quiet invitation to be the same. She found herself politely but more firmly declining Richard's invitations. He seemed mildly perplexed, perhaps even a little affronted, but his social calendar was too full to dwell on one quiet English widow. Their interactions became briefer, a polite nod across the plaza, a wave from his expensive car. Eleanor felt no regret, only a growing sense of liberation. The height of the Pueblo Alba social season was Richard Sterling's annual Fiesta Blanca. It was, by all accounts, the event of the year. Everyone was expected to wear white, transforming his already impressive villa and sprawling gardens into a vision of ethereal elegance, or so the breathless descriptions went. Eleanor had received a gilt-edged invitation weeks in advance. She'd initially placed it on her mantelpiece, a symbol of her continued, albeit reluctant, connection to that world. As the date approached, however, a familiar anxiety began to prickle. "You are going, aren't you, Eleanor?" asked a neighbour, Mrs. Periwinkle, whose social life revolved around such events. "Richard would be terribly disappointed, and it's such fun." Eleanor murmured something non-committal. Part of her, the part that still yearned for acceptance, for an easy camaraderie, felt she should go. Perhaps this time it would be different. Perhaps, amidst the sea of white, she would find her place. Another, stronger part, the part that had tasted the quiet authenticity of Sophia's studio, recoiled at the thought of the noise, the superficiality, the sheer effort of it all. In the end, a sense of obligation, and perhaps a lingering, foolish hope, won out. She found a simple white linen dress, one she'd bought years ago for a summer holiday with Arthur. As she dressed, she felt a familiar sense of preparing for a performance, rather than an evening of pleasure. Richard's villa was, indeed, a spectacle. Fairy lights twinkled in the olive trees, a band played music that was just a little too loud for conversation, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the aroma of roasting lamb. White-clad figures drifted across the manicured lawns like elegant ghosts. Richard himself, resplendent in a white silk shirt, was in his element, gliding from group to group, his laughter echoing, his handshakes firmer, his compliments effusive but generic. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness. The sheer volume of chatter, the competing narratives of impressive holidays, successful children, and shrewd investments, washed over her. "Darling, you look divine," a woman she vaguely recognized trilled, before turning away to greet someone else with the exact same enthusiasm. She saw people whose names she couldn't recall, people who nodded at her with polite, blank smiles. She tried to engage in a conversation about local politics, but it quickly devolved into complaints about parking. Richard spotted her. "Eleanor, so glad you could make it. Marvellous, isn't it?" He squeezed her arm, his eyes already scanning the crowd over her shoulder. "You must meet the Henderson Joneses. They've just bought the old mill. Fascinating people." And then he was gone, swept away in the social current. She found herself standing alone by a bubbling fountain, a glass of champagne she didn't want in her hand. The beautiful setting, the carefully curated elegance, felt like a facade, a beautiful empty stage set. She felt utterly, profoundly invisible, a speck of dust in a glittering machine. The noise pressed in on her, the laughter seemed forced, the smiles too bright. This wasn't connection, it was a competition, a display. A deep, aching loneliness, sharper than any she had felt before, settled in her heart, with a quiet resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Eleanor placed her untouched champagne flute on a nearby table. She didn't make excuses, didn't say goodbye to anyone. She simply turned and walked away, slipping through a gap in the oleander hedge, out of the bright lights, and into the blessed anonymity of the unlit service path. The cool night air on her face was a relief. Instead of heading back to Casa Serenidad, her feet, as if with a will of their own, carried her through the sleeping, moon-washed streets of Pueblo Alba towards the quiet alley where Sophia's studio lay. A soft yellow light glowed from within. Sophia looked up, surprised, as Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was glazing a row of small, delicate cups, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of damp clay and warm kilns filled the small space. "Eleanor," she said, her voice calm, a question in her eyes. "Is everything all right?" "Richard's party," Eleanor said, the words feeling inadequate. "It was too much." Sophia nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her gaze. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a simple wooden stool. She poured Eleanor a glass of water from a clay jug, the water cool and tasting faintly of earth. Then she fetched a small cup and poured a little of what looked like herbal tea into it from a thermos. "Manzanilla," she offered. "From the hills." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. The only sounds, the distant chirping of crickets, and the occasional soft sigh from the cooling kiln. The chamomile tea was fragrant and soothing. Then Sophia began to speak, not about the party or Eleanor's distress, but about the small local craft fair she was preparing for, her hopes for selling a few pieces, the joy she found in seeing her work find a home. She talked about the coolness of the evening, the scent of night-blooming jasmine drifting in from a neighbour's garden. Eleanor listened, the tension slowly ebbing from her shoulders. The conversation was unhurried, unforced, flowing like a gentle stream. There were no pronouncements, no judgments, just a simple sharing of thoughts and observations. In the quiet intimacy of the studio, surrounded by Sophia's earthy, honest creations, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace, a connection so real and grounding it was almost palpable. This, she realized with a clarity that was like a physical sensation. This was what she had been searching for. Not the glitter and noise of Richard's world, but this quiet, authentic human exchange. She didn't need to be part of the everyone Richard so often invoked. She needed this. The simple truth of it settled in her heart, liberating and sure. A few weeks later, another gilt-edged invitation from Richard Sterling arrived. A charity auction this time, black tie optional. Eleanor looked at it for a moment, then, without a flicker of hesitation or guilt, dropped it into the recycling bin. When Richard saw her in the plaza a few days later and asked if she was coming, she smiled politely. "Thank you, Richard, but I have other plans." He looked momentarily surprised, then shrugged and moved on. Eleanor's other plans often involved Sophia. Sometimes they would share a simple meal, fresh produce from Carmen's market stall cooked in Eleanor's small kitchen, the conversation meandering from books to local history,